r/nosleep. Posted by you/scarymaxx. The new girl at school has my exact same eyes. I've always had the prettiest eyes at school. Everyone says so. Other people in my family have the same, boring brown ones, but mine are green with gold flecks. Everyone says I should be a model when I'm older, and I probably will. All through school, I've dated all of the most popular guys. I love watching them watch me. For homecoming, I'm planning to go with Lee Tucker, the running back. He's already getting calls from a bunch of SEC schools, and I've caught him staring at me a bunch of times. There's only one problem: the new girl. Her name is Ileana, and she has my exact same eyes. I saw it the minute she arrived at school. There they were, like looking in a mirror, the same green luster, the exact same gold flecks in all the exact same places. Except that she has this pale, blank face. It made me sick to look at, honestly, like putting a $2 frame around the Mona Lisa. Worst of all, no one else seemed to notice how ugly she is. She'd barely been at school 2 hours when I saw Lee and some of the other football players chatting her up at her locker. The whole time they were talking to her, though, she just stared down the hall at me, like she was in a trance or something. After school, I saw her sitting on the front of her car in the parking lot, waiting for me. She drives this Frankenstein of an old Camry, complete with a driver's side door with no paint. It's basically the opposite of my cute little BMW. My dad got it for me. Of course, he's one of the top 5 pediatric surgeons in the country, so he can afford it. "You must be Alice," said Ileana. "I was wondering if we could go get some coffee." She blinked, and TBH, it kind of made my stomach turn, because it was like she was blinking my eyes. "Why would I do something like that?" I asked. "Come on," she said, smiling. "We're connected. You can tell that, right? We should be friends." "I've got friends," I said. Then I got in my car and peeled away while she stared at me in this super creepy way. At dinner, my dad could tell I was moping, so he asked me, "What's wrong, pumpkin?" And then I told him about Ileana and how she talked with Lee and about her stupid eyes. My dad practically choked on his chicken parm. "You stay away from that girl," he told me. "Don't even speak to her." I told him he was kind of freaking me out, but he just repeated himself and then got his worried dad look and said he had to make some phone calls. So, with dad acting totally psycho, I grabbed my phone and decided to do a little light Instagram stalking. Lee is kind of basic in terms of his Instagram game, but I can't help scrolling through his pics. Except this time, I found like 5 pictures of him and Ileana chowing down on enchiladas at Señor Taco. I screamed and tossed my phone, which totally cracked on the marble floor. Oh well, time for an upgrade, I guess. After that whole incident, I decided that Ileana and I needed to have a little chat. I tracked her down at her locker and asked if she wanted to grab Starbucks after 4th period, and she was totally up for it. At coffee, she kind of stared at me like a shy puppy, looking at me with my own eyes. Every once in a while, she peeped out little questions like, "Do you have any brothers and sisters? And what's your dad like? Why did you move here?" I asked after playing nice for a few minutes. "Did something bad happen at your last school?" She shook her head. "This might sound silly, but I moved here for you. I've been looking for you for a long time," she said. Psycho, we just met." "Yeah, cool," I said, casually finishing my latte. Better get back to my dad." "Say hi for me," she said. "Yeah, sure." Dinner that night turned out to be weirdly tense, especially after I mentioned my coffee with Ileana. "I told you to stay away from her," my dad said, squeezing his fork so tight his fist turned white. "Why?" I said. "Is she like your love child or something?" "No," he said. "She's just his pager went off. Just stay away. She could be dangerous. I need a few days to figure out why she's here." I really wanted to do what dad advised, but the next day at school I walked into the cafeteria to find Lee and Ileana fully making out at the corner table. I fully dropped my salad, which got dressing all over my best Jimmy Choo boots. I walked over to them, going full Real Housewives psycho. "Who the fuck do you think you are?" I shouted at Ileana. "I just wanted to see what you like about him," she said. "Why you picked him, you know. Or maybe I wanted to know what it was like to kiss him. You've been given so much in your life. Sometimes I think you don't even realize it. The car, the boy, the money. But are you grateful for any of it? You realize you and I aren't dating, right?" interjected Lee. I uncapped the green machine juice I was drinking and flung it all over them. "You're dead," I told Ileana. "Dead." She licked at a bit of the juice as it trickled down her face. "I hope you don't mean that," she said. I wanted so badly to like you, Alice. I wanted to give this whole process some time. Now I'm starting to think I should just get it over with. What the hell are you talking about? I shouted, but by then the gym teacher, Mr. Lowry, was pulling me off to the principal's office. After that whole incident, I could tell people were starting to get the impression that I was the psycho bitch, so I decided it was time to control the narrative. I jumped on TikTok and made a little video explaining how Ileana had come into school to steal my boyfriend and was probably wearing colored contacts to copy my signature look, and how basically she was probably trying to steal my whole identity. I titled it "This Psycho Stole My Eyes" and posted it. Believe me, it got plenty of views, and the comments told me I was totally in the right. Knowing that justice was on my side, I grabbed a large rock from the field by the parking lot and smashed it through the windshield of Ileana's tragedy of a car, which honestly was probably an upgrade for that piece of junk. As the rock rolled to the pavement, I looked back to see Ileana watching me with my eyes, and a slightly amused expression on her face. She mouthed words into the wind that I couldn't hear. Before I had to look at her for even a second longer, I got in my car and drove home. I woke up in the middle of the night from a really good dream about Lee and found someone in bed with me. Lee? I whispered, half asleep. Did you sneak in? It's me, said a soft voice. I thought it would be a nice surprise. I looked into my own eyes, blinking back at me. Ileana? I asked. I know we're not sisters, she said. Not all the way anyway. And we never got to be babies together. But we still have time. I started screaming as loud as I could. Over and over again. This isn't how I wanted it to be, she said. I know it's not your fault the way you are, I mean. He spoiled you. But I wanted to at least get to know you before. Dad! I screamed. Help! His room was only a few feet from mine. His footsteps should have been thudding down the hall by now. I'm sorry, she said. He can't come. You see, this whole thing, it was really between him and me. I was just projecting a few things onto you. But you're really just another victim here. She got up and looked out at the full moon, examining something in her palm. I did have a sister when I was born, she continued. A real one. A twin. They said she died at birth, but something never quite made sense to me. You see, they lost her body at the hospital. It happens sometimes, they say. They get mixed up with other medical waste and then thrown into the incinerator. But my mom always said she heard 2 cries when I was born. She saw 2 healthy babies. Something was dripping down her hand, dripping out of whatever she was holding. I lay in the bed, my covers tight around me, like they'd protect me from the boogeyman. And would you believe that same night, at that same hospital, a little girl was born to one of the top pediatric surgeons in the country? Now, it may take some digging, but if you look at that little baby's medical records, they'll tell you she was born blind. Yet somehow those records later got altered to say her eyes were fine. Odd, don't you think? She took a step toward me. Where do you think that little blind girl got her eyes? No. I started to say. No. You keep telling everyone I've got your eyes. I copied you. I'm here to tell you, yours are stolen. She exhaled sharply. But like I said, none of this is your fault. You're just the beneficiary. And now the price is paid. We can leave as friends. She opened her palm to reveal what she'd been holding all this time, a pair of eyeballs, fully intact and dripping with blood. I knew from their dull brown color who they belonged to. Dad, I said weakly. The price is paid now, she said. It's possible he's still alive if you hurry. She pulled open my clenched hand and put the eyeballs inside. Here, she said. You keep them. My dad didn't end up making it. The funeral is coming up this week. At least everyone at school felt bad for me. Lee even offered to take me out to a movie. I went, but I wasn't really into it. I just spent the whole time looking over my shoulder, wondering if she was there. The cops are still looking for Ileana, but they don't have much to go on. Apparently, that wasn't even her real name. The police have some grainy camera footage from Ileana at school, but it wasn't really enough to get a description out to the media. I tried to describe what she looked like, but her features are so boring it was hard to even describe them. Just look at my eyes, I told them, wishing I could rip their stupid faces off. She's got the same ones. It's just eyes, said one of the cops. Not really enough of a detail to go on. What else have you got? I shook my head. Nothing. Posted by you/scarymaxx. I see the same woman in all the burning buildings. The first time I saw her was inside a trailer fire, down by the old highway. It was in mid-century unit, and boy did it light up quick. By the time we got there, the back half was fully blazing. We got the hoses on, but then the owner runs up, a walking skeleton of a lady, teeth mostly gone, screaming about her babies inside. "What do you think, boss? Seems pretty damned methed up to me," said Tico. I shook my head. "Gotta check it out." The front door was a total no-go, but I was able to enter through a sliding glass door around back that had already shattered by the time I reached it. I listened for children crying but didn't hear a thing over the roar of the fire. Down a narrow hallway choked with smoke, I entered a back bedroom. I saw the cats first. Whatever color they'd once been, they were black and gray now, the life well out of them. Then I saw her. She was a tall woman, the same height as me, 6 foot even. She wore a dress of finely woven red feathers that matched her flowing hair. She picked up one of the dead cats and held it close to her breast. "Poor thing," she said. "Poor little thing. Lady, we've got to get the hell out of here," I shouted over the roar of the fire, but she just rocked the cat like a baby, cooing softly to it. "You'll be warm forever now, little one," she said. The heat was even more furious by then, the cat practically turning to ashes in her arms, but the woman only smiled, ignoring the fire around her. "Now," I shouted, but she turned her back to me, walking deeper into the fire. Then the roof around her started to come down, forcing me to back away. I didn't tell Tico or any of the other guys at the station about what I'd seen. I'm sure I would have sounded crazy. Who knows, maybe I'd gotten a whiff of the wrong smoke when I walked inside that trailer. I probably would have forgotten the whole thing, except that a month later, I saw her again. The time, we were over on the north side of town, a 5-story job, all lit up. And this time it wasn't cats. Apparently, a dad had come home to find the whole place lit up and went running in to get his wife and kids. None of them had come out. This time, Tico and I went in together. We found the dad in the stairwell halfway between the 2nd and 3rd stories, passed out from the smoke but still alive. Tico slung him over one shoulder and trucked him out of there, promising to come back as soon as he could. I had to push through the door of the apartment. When I did, a hot rush of air practically knocked me off of my feet. I had to crawl in as I watched the ceiling burn above me. The lady sat on a burning bed, the black body of a small boy in her lap. She stroked his charred hair, which snapped cleanly into her long fingers. "Naughty boy," she said. "You tried to run. But I forgive you." She looked up at me, the fire reflecting big and red in her eyes. "Now you," she said, smiling. "You run in to visit me. My kind of man." She licked her lips. Then she started to remove the straps of her dress, revealing milky shoulders. "But you never seem to want to linger. What's the matter? Don't you want to stay?" For a second, I had the crazy urge to walk toward her, to start taking off my mask and gear. But then I heard a cough. Over in the corner, under the lifeless body of his mother, was a second boy, this one alive. Before I let myself have too much time to think, I ran for him, picked him up, and ran out of there as fast as possible. Right outside, I ran into Tico. I was only a few steps out the door, when we heard the stairwell come down, the concrete fully crumbling in a cascading failure. We got clear of the building and delivered the boy to the EMTs, who had just arrived on scene. "I've got to get back in there," I was saying, over and over again, maybe to Tico, maybe to myself. "It's done, boss, it's done," Tico was saying, but I couldn't help myself. I kept walking toward the building. It took the whole rest of the crew to restrain me. Since then, I've been stuck on desk duty. Yesterday, there was a big job downtown, a whole complex lit up. It seems like there are a lot more fires than usual this year. A lot more. Maybe after things settle down a little bit, they'll let me back on the truck. In the meantime, I find myself playing with my lighter a little more often. Smoking cigarettes for the first time since my 20s. At home, all alone, I make soup for one and watch the gas burner the whole time, sometimes even after the water is boiling. Sometimes even after my food is fully charred. Posted by you/scarymaxx. The ghosts are harmless if you give them what they want. My wife, Soyoon, and I knew the house was haunted when we moved in. The previous owner was upfront about it. It was part of the reason the place was so cheap. Well, officially it was because his dog and daughter had died here, horribly. "Just give them what they want and you'll be okay," he asked the realtor to tell us. She handed us the keys and smiled, shaking her head. "Don't worry about all of that, though. His psychosis is your gain. This place was a steal. It's not like the ghosts can just come out and tell you what they want, but they definitely have their ways of communicating. Like the first night we got here, I left a moving box full of plates on top of one of the dining room chairs. We woke up in the middle of the night to hear it crashing down, the plates all shattered into a million pieces and scattered all over the floor. And that's how we learned their first rule. Lesson 1. Always leave the chairs empty for the ghosts. Other rules would follow. We learned not to leave anything on the floor of the pantry after the ghosts wrote a nasty message in Cheerios all over the floor. We learned not to run the dryer at night after 2 fires. We weren't sure if the first one was from the ghosts or just a lint buildup. So Yoon and I tried to take these little acts of revenge in stride, cleaning up the Cheerio curse words with a smile, and joking with each other about our picky house guests. For a while, it seemed like things would be just fine. We listed out the rules on a small whiteboard affixed to the refrigerator so that we could continue to cohabitate. Lesson 5. No bananas in the house. Lesson 6. The car should always be parked in the driveway, never the garage. Lesson 7. No houseplants, maybe just no ferns? Worth investigating more? Lesson 8. Downstairs shades must be drawn down at night at all times. No exceptions. It became a bit of a game between us, each of us trying to remember all of the rules better than the other. But then one night, Soyoon went to get a glass of water downstairs after midnight. "Don't do it," I said. "They won't like it." "I'm thirsty," she said. "They can live with it." She went downstairs and I heard a scream. I ran downstairs to find her grabbing her foot in agony. She said she'd tried to get ice and then heard a loud snap. She looked down to see her big toe bent away from her foot at an impossible angle. "Okay," I said. "No ice after midnight? No ice at all?" I took out a whiteboard marker. "What do we write?" "I can't live here anymore," she said. "We have to go. We'll never be able to afford another place like this," I told her. "Especially now that interest rates are up. It's just ice, right?" But she shook her head. I drove her to the ER in silence. The next morning, Soyoon started packing her things. "Don't do this," I said. "Why did we leave our previous apartment?" she asked, looking at me with cold, angry eyes. "Huh? Why did we leave?" "Because it was too small," I lied. There had been a group of teens who lingered outside of the front of our building, the types who sat on cars and rolled packs of cigarettes into the sleeves of their t-shirts. Every day, when Soyoon entered the building, they hurled insults at her, mocking her weight, sometimes her race, asking to see her naked. I had called the police several times to report them, but it never went anywhere. In time we decided to move to the suburbs. "You never stood up for me," she said after a bit. "You should have fought those boys. You should have rattled a baseball bat or a crowbar at them. That's illegal. Before that it was your mother's house. Almost a full year sleeping in separate rooms." "Her house, her rules," I said. "And whose house is this?" she asked, zipping her suitcase shut. She drove off to her mother's house. The next morning, I woke up and went to the store. I bought bananas and a houseplant. I bought a shirt in a dark red color I knew the ghosts would hate. Finally, I texted Soyoon and told her I'd be a man she could be proud of. She didn't respond. Last of all, I took a single glass of water and placed it on a chair. Then I stood there as minutes passed, almost an hour. I stared into the emptiness of the dining room. Then, all of a sudden, the glass flew across the room and shattered on the wall. I stood in place, trying not to blink. Then one of the shards rose from the floor and moved slowly toward me. The shard pierced my ankle, drawing a line straight up my leg, working its way under my underwear and up my thigh. I tried not to flinch as blood pooled in a small puddle at my feet. "This is my house," I said softly. "Mine." The glass rose right up to my eye, and in that moment, I realized that the ghosts had died to make this their house. Was I willing to do the same? I blinked. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm sorry." And then I got a broom to clean up the mess. Since then, I've been doing my best to keep playing by the rules. Lesson 15. Don't make any noise when descending the stairs. Lesson 16. No hats inside. Lesson 17. Do not enter the closet beneath the stairs, ever. And the final lesson has been hardest to swallow. At night, I must leave Soyoon's side of the bed empty, must not even stretch a leg onto it. As I close my eyes, I feel something cold and damp settle onto her side. It will not let me look at it. My heart beats fast and my blood runs cold, but no matter how much I want to scream and sprint out of the house, I remind myself that if I just play by the rules, everything will be okay. Posted by you/scarymaxx. I gave some trick-or-treaters bloody candy and now they won't stop knocking. I got to a point in life where I got tired of seeing other people and moved to the middle of the woods where no one would bother me. Truth be told, I wasn't the sort of man most people wanted in their neighborhoods anyway. These days, on 100 acres down several miles of dirt roads, I saw a neighbor maybe once, twice a year. A little before dusk on Halloween, I'd been building garden beds and nicked my thumb on my saw blade. I wasn't gushing blood, so I kept on working until the job was done, then headed in for a shower and a drink. I'd just gotten dressed when the first knock came. At first, I thought it must be my imagination. I hadn't heard a car pull up. I looked out the window and didn't see anything, so I figured it must have been raccoons knocking around the front porch again. Then I heard the knock again. Definitely at the door this time. "Who is it?" I shouted, but there was no response. I opened the door and looked down to see two children no taller than my belt, both dressed in white sheets with jagged eye holes cut for eyes. They held out pristine orange pumpkin baskets, both totally empty. "Trick or treat," they shouted together. For a second I stood fairly well frozen, but the kids just stared at me, holding out their baskets and waiting. I felt like I had to do something. I don't exactly keep a bag of lollipops in the house, but I managed to find a few old cough drops in a drawer and drop them into the kids' pumpkins. It wasn't until after they fell in that I saw I'd left a smear of blood on the wrappers. I looked up, prepared to apologize, but the kids looked up at me with big, thankful eyes. "So generous," said one. "Delicious," said the other. Before I could ask them where their parents were or how they'd gotten to my house, they pulled the door closed behind them. Then I heard their little footfalls pounding down my front steps. I sat down in my armchair and turned on the TV, trying not to get too up in my own head. Probably, they were just the closest neighbor's grandkids, wandering a ways from home. I'd never liked children. Especially the sound of them. Laughing, screaming. Sometimes, I just get filled with this unstoppable need to shut them up. I heard another knock. There'd be no candy this time. I walked to the door and opened it, ready to toss the little miscreants down the stairs. But this time there were three girls, slightly older, all dressed as skeletons. "Trick or treat. We heard you've got the best treats." The tallest girl gestured over her shoulder to the two little boys from earlier. They were standing near the base of the steps, holding hands, their pumpkins at their feet. "I'm not sure I've got anything left," I said. "That's too bad," said the middle one. "Yes, we'd have to play a trick," said the littlest one. I rummaged in a small bowl near the door and found some change, dropping a quarter into each girl's pumpkin. The oldest one lifted the coin out carefully, inspecting it in the fading sunlight. Like the cough drops, the coin was smudged with a bit of my blood. "Very kind," she said. "Very generous." "So delicious," said the little one. "It's not chocolate," I was saying as they closed the door. I had barely turned away when I heard a deep thudding against the door. This time, I looked outside to see a single fat teenager dressed as a bat. I didn't open the door. The thudding continued. "Trick or treat," the boy shouted, his voice low and holding an edge of violence. Looking out the window, I saw that the three skeleton girls were standing with the ghost boys now, all holding hands and staring in at me through the living room window. The fat teenager descended the stairs and joined them. It's been a few hours now, and the knocks just keep coming. More kids keep joining the first ones, all holding hands, all staring in at me. I've seen them passing my coins around, popping them in their mouths. There are at least a few dozen trick-or-treaters now. They're looking in through all the windows. Some of them are staring at walls as if they can see right through them. Every once in a while, one yells trick or treat and the others laugh as if sharing a private joke. I've been trying to stop my thumb from bleeding, but it just won't. I've soaked bandage after bandage, and the wound just stays wet, even though it's barely a nick. The air is starting to smell strange too, a weird mix of cough drops and coin and the iron of the blood. Outside, the crowd keeps growing. The yelling and laughing are quieting down, replaced with a sense of anticipation. It's only now that I realize they are forming a circle around my house. It's almost complete. Posted by you/scarymaxx. Trespassing. Part 1. I grew up in rural Oregon but got the hell out of Dodge as soon as I turned 18. My family was dirt poor, which actually helped me pick up a decent scholarship at U of O even though it was only a few hours from home. I barely visited, and when I graduated and got a job working on the new Hubble over in Colorado, I jumped at the chance. My older brother Frank never left. Frank and I were never that close. He had a mean streak, honestly. Once, as part of a game, he tied me up and told me to try to wrestle myself free. After I struggled for a few minutes and couldn't get loose, I asked him to untie me, but Frank just laughed and left me bound in the middle of our living room floor until our dad got home. When I explained what happened, my dad looked at me incredulously. He shook his head and said, "You're lucky he didn't do you worse." Lucky for me, I grew up big, while Frank topped out at 5'5". Who knows what might have happened if he was the bigger one. The animals around our house weren't so lucky. When I was in 6th grade and Frank was a freshman in high school, he came running into the house one day, holding something bloody in his shirt. "Look, look, look," Frank kept mumbling. Then he knelt and unfurled his shirt so that its contents dropped onto the floor. It was a raccoon, its belly cut all the way down so that its guts were hanging out. It was mostly dead. Mostly. Its heart was still beating, and its lungs pulsed frantically. It reeked like fresh bile. "Get that out of here," I said. "Before Dad sees it." By then, my dad's drinking had gotten worse, and he was done trying to talk sense into my brother. We all knew there was something broken in Frank, and my dad would try to beat it out of him, for all of the good it ever did. "Wait," said Frank. "Look." He placed his full hand over the animal's snout and pulled up. As he did, the muscles of its neck pulled up. With its skin cut away, you could see where the tendons and muscles connected. "Cool, right?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Cool. But get rid of it before Dad sees." The thing was, I wasn't as disgusted as I knew I should have been, and I didn't like that. Frank tossed the raccoon far in the backfield for the coyotes to scavenge, and I cleaned up the blood it had dribbled onto the hardwood with dish soap and paper towels. As Frank got older, I wouldn't say he changed, but he at least got smarter about channeling his interests. He started hunting, almost always alone. He'd disappear for a weekend and come back with tremendous bucks, dripping blood out the back of his battered Chevy 1500. We had a back, unused garage where Frank would drain the meat and preserve the antlers, though he never got too great at either. Over time, I kind of realized Frank had zero interest in dead things. Once a deer was dead, it may as well have been a lump of dirt to him. What fascinated him was that line between life and death. My first memory is this: Frank, 6 years old with a moth trapped in an overturned water glass, watching it beat its wings against the sides as it tried to reach the bare, overhead bulb that illuminated our bedroom. He flicked out light switch up and down, watching the little insect flurry with motion each time the light came on. I hadn't seen Frank in almost 10 years when I got the news my father had died at 54. Cancer in both the liver and the lungs, like smoking and drinking, were racing to see which could kill him first. Frank picked me up from the Medford airport in the same Chevy he'd been driving since high school. Apparently he'd gotten handy at fixing things since we'd been away and was eking out a living as a part-time mechanic. Honestly, he was nothing but nice to me. He took me by the old high school, and to a pizza place he knew I'd used to like. He kept patting me on the arm or bringing me in for a one-arm hug, telling me how awesome it was to see me. I was starting to feel guilty that I hadn't kept in better touch. That night, we got drunk off what was left of our dad's supply and got to talking. Frank didn't ask a single question about what I'd done since I left town, just wanted to rehash old times. He asked me why I'd never come hunting with him. I said I always thought he preferred his solitude. "No," he said. "Everything was always better when we were together. When I had you to watch me. Listen, you want to head up and do some hunting with me tomorrow?" Maybe it was the whiskey talking. I said I'd go with him. Sorry for rambling. I'm actually having a little trouble writing about what happened next, and I'm still exhausted. I'll try to post about it once I've gotten a good night's sleep. Trespassing. Part 2. The morning after my return to town, I woke with a biting headache. In truth, I don't usually let myself drink alcohol. I don't like that feeling, that loss of control, and my work on the Hubble requires steady hands. In truth, I'm at my happiest right after I've donned my gear and stepped into the airlock outside the cleanroom, ready to start work. Once the HVAC whirs on and the air shower is done, I enter the lab. There, every piece of equipment is right where I left it. Everything in its right place, everything perfectly clean. By the time I'd hit the bathroom and showered, Frank was ready to go, dressed in his hunting gear, full camos, with a rifle slung over his back. He stood perfectly still by the window, watching leaves spiral in the wind. He offered me a similar set of clothes, but I knew there was no way I'd fit. Instead, I grabbed one of my dad's old, bright orange hunting jackets. In the hallway mirror, Frank and I made quite a pair, one hunter who wanted to be invisible, another who wanted to be seen. The drive up consisted of silence punctuated with staccato conversation. "Married?" Frank asked, and I shook my head. "You?" I asked, and he chuckled softly. As we drove up through the hills, I spotted a family of deer peering toward us from a nearby stand of trees. "Rats of the forest," said Frank. "You could kill a dozen a week, and no one would miss them." "We hunting here?" I asked. Frank shook his head. Farther up. Way out. Place those Forest Service goons won't bother us. I just missed out on $2 or $3 last weekend. Hell, we could probably bag all of them. All of them? I'd never seen my brother bring home more than one at a time. You can't fetch them all back, he explained. What did we ever do with them all? Whatever we don't want, we'll leave for the coyotes. Just like always. He looked at me when he said that last part, and I knew what he was talking about. A few days after my 12th birthday, Frank came tearing into the house, smiling ear to ear. I'd never seen him so happy. I asked him what was going on, and he told me to follow him. That day, we hiked 2 miles down into a canyon near my house. It was raining, and we had to go slow to keep from slipping on the dirty smooth rocks beneath our feet. I kept trying to ask Frank what he wanted to show me, but he kept his lips sealed. Finally, we rounded a bend and I saw what had gotten Frank so excited. A man lay slumped against the canyon wall, barely breathing. He was handsome and clean-shaven, but a froth of white clung to the right side of his mouth, and a steady tremor ran through his body. His eyes focused on his, and I could tell he was trying to say something, but all that came out was a low gurgle. Must have been hiking out here alone, said Frank. Not too smart. He put a hand on the man's ankle, rolling up the jeans just slightly so Frank could touch the skin. The man flinched, as if trying to get away. Try it, said Frank, taking his hand away. You can feel something. I swear. The man was starting to shake harder now. More froth foamed from his mouth. Does anyone else know you can out here today? I asked, and Frank shook his head. Frank grabbed the ankle again, a look of pure pleasure on his face. You've never felt anything like it, he said, but I shook my head. I couldn't let myself. We need to go, I said. He'll know our faces, said Frank. We need to stay. Make sure he's done for sure. It's not long now. I can tell. And so we stayed. It took 2 hours maybe, the whole thing. Eventually, the man's shaking got worse, and finally something seemed to catch in his throat, and his eyes went out. The whole time, Frank didn't let go of the man's ankle. You should have felt it, said Frank. Got to let the pressure out a little at once. Otherwise. We're getting out of here, I said. Now. A ranger found the body a few days later. Turned out to be a librarian, the dad of a kid a few years behind me in school. Prone to seizures, but he hadn't had one in years and must have figured he was safe. By the time they collected the body, a few scavengers had gotten to it. Frank turned off the main road onto a dirt one, and we rumbled downhill into a nearby valley. Have you ever felt another one go? I asked. Another person. Frank shook his head. Not so far, he said. Life, it only gives you so many chances like that. And it was true. When I think back on that day in the canyon, my primary emotion is regret. It took everything I had not to stoop beside my brother and touch the dying man's skin. What if I never got to feel what Frank did? At home that night, long after Frank had fallen asleep, I took a pillow into the bathtub at the far end of the house and screamed into it, over and over again as I wondered what my brother's fingers had felt. The truck came to a stop, and Frank killed the engine, right in front of a no trespassing sign. He smiled. We're here. Trespassing. Part 3. There were no trails where Frank led me. Just an endless expanse of dead leaves under skeletal oaks, not so much as a deer path. Frank, though, charged ahead decisively, navigating the woods as expertly as if he'd lived here his whole life. Follow me, he said. I've got something to show you. Finally, we reached a clearing in a valley. As we approached it, a smell of rotting meat hit me, and the buzz of flies filled my ears. I pulled the top of my t-shirt up to cover my nose, but Frank inhaled deeply, reveling in the stench. Before us, lay deer carcasses, maybe 300 of them. Some were fresh, dead less than a few weeks. Others were little more than bones, picked clean by scavengers and the elements. This was Frank's kingdom. I read a book about the way we used to live, started Frank. You read a book? I joked. At my feet lay a freshly killed fawn, its eye still intact. It held my reflection, distorted into nonsense. It was about prehistoric man, Frank continued. People, back before we had guns, knives, bows, all of this garbage. We were scavengers. We'd see the buzzards circling far off, and we'd run that way. Eat whatever was left when we got there. That so? Frank shook his head. Can't say I believe it. Look around you. You see my work. I was born to be a hunter. Maybe that's evolution. You give the buzzards enough time, they turn into hawks. Something like that. We gonna talk or hunt? I asked. Frank nodded and pointed to a nearby hill. The ones I spotted last time were over there, he said. Let's go. We didn't find a single deer. Hours went by as we trudged through the dead leaves, trying to stay quiet. With each passing minute, Frank seemed to get more and more twitchy, like one of the flies had gotten under his skin. They were here, he muttered. 3 of the prettiest bucks you ever saw. Soon, the sun was fading in the far mountains. Clouds gathered overhead, and the cold grew biting. Where's the truck? I asked, but Frank shook his head like he hadn't heard me. Suddenly, he held up a hand, shushing me, and pointed down near the bone graveyard, now almost a mile away. Down there, he said. Movement. Thing must have circled right around us. Funny. Smell usually drives them away. Look, I said. You can come back tomorrow. Tonight, said Frank, turning from me, and before I knew it, he was running. I followed him as fast as I could, trying not to slide down the hill where the dirt was loose beneath the leaves. Soon, pinpricks of sweat gathered on my skin. They felt like acid in the cold. Finally, we reached the edge of the boneyard. Frank stood with his hands on his knees, panting from the run. He gestured toward the pile. Looking out, I saw something move ever so slightly. It was walking amongst the bodies, sniffing at them. Finally, it lifted its head, and a pair of magnificent antlers cast their silhouettes against the moonlit sky. You do it, said Frank, and I raised my rifle. I always like it better when it's you. I hadn't hunted since high school, but the muscle memory came back pretty quick. Quietly, I adjusted the scope and peered through it, putting the buck in the crosshairs. When I finally got a good look at the buck, though, I knew right away that something was off. First, there was its mouth. The whole left half was just gone. No muzzle, lips, or teeth. Just a gaping maw. Its fur, too, was uneven. Bald in patches, and discolored, more like a patchwork quilt than a hide. The buck took a few steps to the side, and its movement sent a chill through me. It wasn't moving like a deer. Have you ever seen 2 men in a horse suit at Halloween, the way their movements feel out of step? Shoot it, said Frank, but I hesitated. There's something wrong, I said. Now, he said. I pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the woods. It had been perfect, a clean heart shot. But the buck didn't move. It looked back at me, or it would have. Looking through the scope, I was suddenly certain that it had no eyes. Frank raised his rifle. We should go, I said. He lined up the rifle and took his shot. Again, the deer did not fall. He shot again. A third time. This time the buck turned and disappeared into the woods at the far side of the clearing. Frank and I stood there for a few moments, not saying a word. Come on, he finally said. It must be hurt pretty bad. Can't have gotten far. It's night, I said. It's a long drive back. We're not letting it get away, he shouted. Now come on. I wish I'd told him no. God, I wish I'd told him no.